A columnist insisting the press should ease up on Joe Biden.
Dana Milbank writes in his latest column that it's President Biden, not Trump, who may actually have a legitimate gripe with the media.
What about the allegation that the press is underselling the good news? What is the good news?
It's hilarious.
News coverage of Biden in recent months has been bad or worse as that of Donald Trump in 2020.
That's just some of the new debate there over whether the media treats Biden more harshly than Trump. It was kicked up partly by this chart that tracks over 200,000 articles and found sentiment showing more negative coverage of Biden than Trump recently, as you see on the right side. The Washington Post finding that the negative sentiment of coverage in those last 11 months of Trump's term now basically matches Biden's recent period there from the summer on, even as Trump had those COVID surges, his own loss, and, of course, cheering on the insurrection. Now, there are many factors here, but this is important for governance, politics, the whole thing, really. Donald Trump's parade of numbing scandals may have left some in the media treating those kind of problems as a kind of a given, what was once warned about, normalizing Trump. And at least some of the data implicitly suggests that Biden is being graded on some kind of higher standard because he's supposed to return to normalcy. Now, I can tell you that media critique spawned critiques of the critique, ranging from its methodology for tracking positive and negative stories to the more holistic counterpoint that, well, Biden's still governing during a pandemic that won't go away, with inflation problems, and the press may just reflect or even follow the sour mood right now. So, first of all, these sentiment studies, which just sort of broadly track the words used in coverage, that data can certainly be noisy. And I can tell you right now tonight, we're not here to resolve this once and for all. But any decent data is still useful to try to look at the broader patterns or avoid leaning into one's prior beliefs. Psychological data, for example, shows we all tend to prefer evidence, especially anecdotal, that confirms what we already think. Imagine sort of any political debate with your family. And for partisans, that may be, when you look at the press stuff, the idea that, well, their side just doesn't get a fair shake. For people in the media, it could be the idea that, well, we like to think reporters work hard and are trying to be fair, which can then limit our openness to honest, constructive criticism. All right. So here on The Beat, we try to stay open-minded to any fair, honest critiques while ignoring the trolls and the bots. As they say online, don't feed the trolls. You know, those comments that pop up and aren't really real or genuine. They're just trying to get a rise out of you, which has become something of a right-wing kind of political habit. We ignore the trolls. But let's look at the dynamics. The media critique is raising something relevant, how Trump's scandals and incompetence lowered the bar for his expectations, which is something actually the previous Republican president, in a different context, used to talk about.
I will confront another form of bias, the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Trump was the king of low expectations. Take his low, terrible polling. The man was literally the most consistently unpopular president of the modern era. Didn't have a honeymoon, never cracked 50%, and yet influential Beltway outlets would parade out headlines like this, Politico looking at Trump's low, weak 44% approval and saying, well, he's doing great with his base. Trump voters, we do it again. That's how they headlined 44. When Biden gets a similar 44%, he gets voters' doubt rising about his health and mental fitness. Yikes. Remember, the headlines are about the same underlying fact. That data I showed you may be noisy, but Joe Biden, by any political standard, or really forget Biden, any president I could tell you who wins with a good margin, who wins over independents and people in the opposing party and dips to 44, is doing better than the person who won without winning over the other folks. Trump just got the Electoral College and is stuck at 44. Now, Komanduri, a friend of the Beat and strategist, says that Trump has basically hacked the media in ways Biden does not, hitting journalists with so many lies and weaponizing a penchant for both-sides-ism that basically gets him more of the coverage he wants. Trump taking advantage of the need to seem objective rather than reporters choosing to really cover him honestly as what he was clearly then and is now, an anti-democracy candidate. You can see the false equivalence in how pundits will say, well, gosh, if both sides are unhappy, they must be doing something right.
The proof
that we're doing a good job is that Democrats are mad at the media for not helping to sell Joe Biden and their agenda. Not our job. And the fact that they're mad at us for not doing that, I think, is a great endorsement of the job we are doing.
Being tough on any politician or the incumbent president is fine. Claiming that the public reaction validates it doesn't really get you back to the substance. Now, in 2016, voters were hit over and over with credulous media obsessions over Hillary Clinton's private email address. In fact, when they measured it up, emails was by far the most cited term voters said they had heard about her. Now, I mentioned that not to go back down the email double standard, but let's be clear, that's not just a story about politics or political ads attacking the email issue. It's really a reflection of how much the so-called mainstream media really internalized a right-wing frame of Clinton critics that the email attack and its investigation was the most important thing about her and constantly discussed. Now, again, since we're talking about bias, I want to be clear. You can debate whether it was good or bad to use the private emails and whether she handled the issue well. There is certainly evidence that it was not a high point for Hillary Clinton. But the press, when you measure it out, again, if you use the data, there's a lot of signs that it was not proportionate or objective in treating the same issue when it came up in the very next year with her replacement administration. Because the Trump folks did a lot of the same thing. The president using unsecured cell phones that pose the same or greater risk than her email account. In fact, Donald Trump, it was exposed, had two phones. If you remember Kevin Gates, I got two phones, one for the plug and one for the load. Well, some of what Trump's accused of is worse than felonious drug dealing, and that would have just been picked up there. The email stuff, it's back in the news tonight because top aides like Mark Meadows and Trump's own family were also using secret email accounts, but it's just not something that those same outlets covered in the same way with as much proportion or criticism. We have the numbers, the data on that. Sometimes the criticism that is most effective skips some of all this data. You might say, we get it, Ari, you're just going through every little bit. We saw the chart. All right, but here's an informed comedian with a serious take, Bill Maher, looking at the false equivalence back in the day.
Republicans have one path to victory in this election, and it's called false equivalency. They can't deny Trump is horrible. It's on tape. So they want voters to believe Hillary is just as bad. And in pursuit of that goal, they have a very powerful ally. Lazy people. Say they're all the same, and then you can sound justifiably jaded by the entire process when really you just don't know anything.
Bill Maher willing to insult a lot of people with a point that was deadly serious in October 2016, when few in the Republican Party in D.C. or in the press really thought Donald Trump was about to score a hat trick in Wisconsin and take the Electoral College. The point here is not the press trying to do a job to engineer an outcome. That is almost always a bad idea and not very objective. But the other point is the press not falling into these traps, which are designed for the press, or a type of professional vanity where it tries to even up with false equivalence that which, at this moment in time, with people actively trying to stage coups and do racist things and overthrow the government, not all Republicans, but some, trying to falsely equivocate on that, well, it's just not accurate. We bring in Komanduri, who I just quoted, when we're back after our shortest break, just 60 seconds. Now we turn to a special segment here on The Beat, and it's a special day known as Che Day. We're joined by political strategist Komanduri, a veteran of 3 presidential campaigns, including the Obama-Biden race. Thanks for being here, sir.
Good to be here, Ari. How are you?
I'm great. You know, when you hear that music, you know it's Che Day.
Right.
Whether it ever becomes a national holiday is really not up to us. But it's a holiday here on The Beat. There's a lot going on. But we walk back through this, and I want to take criticism of the press seriously, and the chart that we showed is not perfect. But what do you think it reveals about the press, and why is it important when you look at this for everyone, people to be media literate about what they're consuming, and those in the press, and there's more and more people who have social media and other ways to communicate, be conscious of what does seem to be quite a gulf?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about the methodology that Dana Milbank and the Washington Post used, artificial intelligence, et cetera. I'm not an expert on artificial intelligence, but I don't think you need artificial intelligence to know something very clear, which is Joe Biden has had a run of bad press that has now lasted several months. He literally has not seen a good headline in, I would say, maybe 6 months. And the reality also is the press is simply covering Biden the way his opponents would want him to be covered. Nothing positive that Biden has done has gotten any coverage. I'll give you a good example. This year, we cut child poverty in half, thanks to actions undertaken by the Biden administration and the U.S. Congress. That's a major story. We don't really hear about it. What we do hear is a controversy over whether children should learn CRT. That seems to take more precedence over whether they're receiving proper nutrition or if they're going hungry at night. That is something that Joe Biden has very much addressed, and it's gotten absolutely no coverage, and he's gotten no credit for it. In addition, I would say...
Well, I'm going to ask you something because you've worked on campaigns.
Right.
Do you think that there are reporters, so-called mainstream or whatever you want to call it, network reporters, who basically get worked as referees and are thinking more about whether they can, quote unquote, find something to even it up with, as I mentioned, two parties that are not exactly equal when it comes to one of them trying to overthrow the government?
Yeah, well, that actually very much has happened. And one of the worst recipients of that coverage was Hillary Clinton. The reason Hillary Clinton got so much negative coverage over that email server, which wouldn't have been and was not one of the top 100 Trump scandals, was because the media had so much negative stuff to say about Trump because he was simply doing so many negative things. So they felt they had to even out the playing field by playing up this really minor non-scandal. That's exactly what occurred there. And that is exactly what it continues to occur with the media.
Let's dig into that because it goes to what Bill Maher was saying. And, I don't look at him as an expert on everything, but he did nail that point really bluntly because there's different models of journalism. And we're in a time where there's all sorts, everybody knows, the internet and pressures. But if your model is refereeing and one player's fouling more, they get more fouls. If they foul out of the game, so be it. You don't then say, well, we better foul out one of the other strong players on the other team, regardless of what happens. And yet you're describing, and Maher was referring to, reporters who are doing that. And A, is that what you think's happening? And B, how do you fix that other than, I guess, just having better journalism?
Well, that is exactly what has happened repeatedly with Joe Biden and with Hillary Clinton vis-a-vis the Trump Republicans. The Trump Republicans are so bad. Virtually nothing you can say about them is positive. So the press has to compensate by playing up Biden and Hillary scandals. Now, Biden has actually been running a year with a scandal-free administration, it should be pointed out, that I don't think he's gotten any credit for. I think he should definitely get some credit for that. With Trump, it was a daily occurrence that was happening as well. But I also wouldn't underestimate the role that ratings sort of plays in all of this. The reality is that
ratings.
The press
what are ratings?
Right. They're basically correct. Like that's like the fuel that all network news or TV news works on. But and you, of course, already have excellent ratings, it should be pointed out, winning the 6 o'clock time slot. But the reality is that what kind of creates ratings are cultural conflicts where you can sort of present both sides as equivalent, as having equivalent sort of arguments. So that's why, for example, CRT has gotten more press than the cutting of child poverty in half. That's just quite frankly, a ratings getter. You can present that as a racial discussion, racial controversy.
Right, and that goes to what people may then want to go to, and you're raising something that's larger than this segment, but we may come back to it with you, Che, because there's more than one Che Day, which is, all jokes aside about ratings, the competitive pressures on the press have only increased across mediums. A lot of print outlets now need the online component, which makes clicks a much bigger pressure on them. TV has its own pressures. We don't deny that. And that, again, creates the question of what kind of stories are actually being pursued at a systemic level, which, again, we think the press, it's worthwhile for us to be transparent about that as we kind of look at these issues if we're a part of some of it. We also still try to do our stories regardless of some of it. I got to get to another guest, so Che, I'm going to just say to be continued, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ari.